So with that one, I'd read the story of the bananas. All of the ideas for these videos came from, I was living in Paris, and there's this amazing library there called the American Library in Paris. And it's a weird place because they have just this huge archive of secondhand books from the 80s and 90s. And for me, it was a treasure trove of kind of out of print ideas. And I was able to find ideas that weren't really online, which really excited me, like I was something new to share. So I think I read a book, and it might actually have been specifically, either had a chapter about the whole bananas and the CIA plot in it, or the whole book was about that. But I remember going, there's a great video here. This is a really interesting counterintuitive idea. And it starts with this object that we all know. And it's a great way to kind of widen it out to this big historical drama. My next stage actually then was to go to see what material existed. Before I wrote anything, before I structured anything, I was like, I need to find out what visuals there is. By this stage, I was thinking, what are the visuals before I get too far down the road of writing the scripts? Like, what assets are there? And actually, there's a huge amount. I got really lucky. So I use the Prelinger archives a lot for a lot of these videos, which is this open source, public domain collection of films that can be used. Lots of ephemeral, old ephemeral films, government films from the 1950s. And they had a whole bunch of propaganda, basically, that was made by the US government to kind of promote the bananas industry in places like Guatemala. And so there were these mini documentaries. And so I had great footage, like contemporary footage of these banana plantations. And then among that were also this one commercial that was made by, I think, the United Fruit Company with this animated banana. And I think the last asset then was also the shots of violence, which was harder to find. I had to find some old documentaries and take it from there, of kind of the bloodshed in Guatemala that happened as a result. And for me, there were two big revelations that came out of that film, or two things I tried to do. So one was the idea of detonating an idea through juxtaposition. So one thing I'm very proud of in that bananas film is I don't tell you, in the end, I don't tell you, and as a result of all of this, hundreds of thousands of people died in horrible ways just for our bananas. That idea is detonated in the mind of the audience by playing the propaganda, the cartoon, and then juxtaposing it, intercutting with shots of the violence. And it creates this really horrid, dark, kind of ironic, dramatic ironic juxtaposition between the two. And I think I come up with that quite early on in the design. I was like, oh, I could put these two bits together, and that's going to be brutal, and that's really going to like explode the idea in people's heads in a very emotional way. But it only works if you set up the advert, the commercial first. And the other big takeaway for me was this idea of setup and payoff as a dramatic kind of story structure concept, that you introduce an idea. If you want people to understand something, you need to kind of set it up earlier on. It's almost like a reverse Chekhov's gun. This idea of like, if you show a gun in Act 1, it's got to go off in Act 3. Well, if you do it backwards, it's more powerful. So if you want something to go off in Act 3, make sure they see it in Act 1. I think about that a lot. I still use that idea now when I'm like, okay, if I can think about how the film's going to end, what's the big climax for this? And in fact, that's actually how I ended up making films after that. I was like, I'd go into it thinking, what's the climax? What's the big showdown at the end? And is it going to be, A, is it going to be cool? Is it going to be really emotional? And then B, how do I create the most interesting journey to get to that? And how do I set up all the pieces I'm going to need to detonate that payoff at the end? I think that bananas film was the big learning curve for me on that. So it was about making sure I set up the banana commercial, you see it, early in Act 2, so that when it comes back, you don't need to be told what it is. You just see that horrible contrast between the joyful music of that against the kind of horror of the real consequences.